Hey guys, settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a warm drink. Tonight, we're not exactly diving into tales of heroic knights or glamorous queens. Nope, tonight we're going a little grittier. We're going to talk about the jobs that no one really wants to talk about. The kind of jobs that make you appreciate modern plumbing and, well, not having to handle raw sewage for a living. So, get comfy, because we're about to explore the absolutely delightful, utterly disgusting, and frankly quite malodorous world of medieval occupations. It's going to be a long, slow drift through the less than pleasant aspects of historical daily life, perfect for lulling you into a state of serene contemplation, or perhaps just a very deep sleep. Let's start with one that truly gets to the bottom of things, shall we? The Gong Farmer. Yes, Gong Farmer. It sounds rather whimsical, doesn't it? Like someone who tends to a field of percussive instruments. But alas, no. A gong farmer was essentially the medieval equivalent of a septic tank emptier, but on a much, much more personal and hands-on level. These poor souls were responsible for clearing out the cesspits, privies, and latrines of medieval towns and castles. Imagine, if you will, a dark, enclosed space filled to the brim with human waste. That's their office. Their tools? A shovel, a bucket, and presumably a very, very strong constitution, or perhaps just a profound sense of resignation. The work was, unsurprisingly, utterly vile. Not only was it physically demanding, requiring them to dig and shovel through compacted waste, but the stench alone must have been truly unbearable. We're talking about centuries of accumulated human refuse decomposing in the most unhygienic conditions imaginable. The gases alone could be dangerous, with methane and other delightful concoctions accumulating in these confined spaces. It wasn't uncommon for gong farmers to suffer from asphyxiation or to collapse due to the fumes. And let's not even dwell on the sheer volume of biological material they had to contend with. Castles, in particular, with their large populations and often primitive waste disposal systems, would have presented an especially fragrant challenge. The waste would simply drop down shafts into pits below, which, of course, eventually needed to be emptied. And who got that charming task? Our friendly neighborhood gong farmer. The pay, you might imagine, was not exactly princely, though it was often better than other manual labor, due to the sheer unpleasantness of the job. It was a specialist role, after all, and not many were lining up to volunteer. They typically worked at night, under the cover of darkness, both to avoid the general public and their noses, and perhaps to spare themselves some of the daytime heat, which would, naturally, exacerbate the odors. This nocturnal schedule also lent them a certain shadowy, almost mystical air, not that anyone wanted to get too close to investigate. Now, imagine living in a medieval city. You've got your narrow streets, your open sewers running down the middle, and then at night, the clanking and shoveling of the gong farmer going about his business. It's a sensory experience that modern sensibilities can barely comprehend. And yet, it was an essential service. Without the gong farmers, the buildup of waste would have been even more catastrophic, leading to even more widespread disease. So, in their own uniquely disgusting way, they were vital to public health, even if no one wanted to admit it or even acknowledge their existence during daylight hours. Let's gently drift over to another charming profession, the tanner. Ah, tanning, the art of transforming animal hides into leather. Sounds noble enough, doesn't it? Leather is useful. It makes shoes, belts, armor, book bindings, all very practical. The process, however, was anything but appealing. To prepare an animal hide, it first needed to be cleaned of all flesh and hair. This involved soaking the hides in various solutions, and here's where it gets interesting, or rather incredibly pungent. One of the key ingredients in medieval tanning was, you guessed it, urine, specifically human urine, and not just a little. Tanning vats would be filled with urine, often collected from public urinals or even from households. The ammonia in the urine helped to dehair the hides and break down the remaining flesh. So tanneries were not only filled with the smell of decaying animal matter, but also with the strong, eye-watering stench of stale urine. A delightful combination, truly. But wait, there's more.
After the urine bath, the hides would then further be treated with a concoction called dog dung liquor. Yes, you heard that right. Dog feces were collected and mixed with water to create a paste or liquid. This mixture contained enzymes that further helped to soften and condition the leather. So the tanner's working environment was a glorious symphony of putrefaction, ammonia, and animal excrement. Imagine spending your entire workday surrounded by these aromas. It's enough to make one's stomach churn just thinking about it. Tanneries were almost always located on the outskirts of towns, and for very, very good reason. No one wanted a tannery as a next-door neighbor. The smell permeated everything, drifting through the air for miles around. It was a constant reminder of the less savory aspects of medieval life. The tanners themselves were often considered a bit of an outcast class, not just because of the smell that clung to them in their homes, but also because their work was seen as unclean. Their hands and clothes would be stained, and the stench would be practically tattooed onto their very being. It was a job that marked you, quite literally, from the moment you started. And the process itself was incredibly labor-intensive. Hides had to be scraped, stretched, soaked, and worked by hand for weeks, sometimes months. It was a skilled trade, requiring a good understanding of chemistry, if they didn't call it that, and a strong back. But the glamour was certainly not the package. So the next time you slip on a comfortable pair of leather shoes, just take a moment to reflect on the truly extraordinary and utterly disgusting journey that material took from animal to accessory, thanks to the tireless, stench-soaked efforts of the medieval tanner. Let's gently turn our attention to another unsung hero of medieval hygiene, or lack thereof, the fuller. Fulling was a crucial step in textile production, specifically for wool cloth. It involved
cleaning and thickening wool fabric, making it denser, stronger, and more resistant to shrinking. Sounds like a good thing, right? Well, the method, that's where the medieval ingenuity really shines, in the most bizarre way. The traditional method of fulling involved workers, often men, literally stomping on wet wool fabric in large vats. And what did they stomp it in? Water, yes, but often a mixture of water and human urine. Again with the urine. It seems medieval society had a very practical approach to waste products. The ammonia in the urine acted as a detergent, helping to clean the wool and facilitate the felting process, which is how the fibers interlock and the cloth thickens. So imagine a group of fullers, barefoot, standing in vats of stale urine, rhythmically stomping on wet wool for hours on end. The smell, of course, would have been horrendous. The sloshing, the exertion, the constant exposure to what we now consider a biohazard. It wasn't exactly a spa treatment. Fullers would often work in teams, sometimes singing or chanting to keep rhythm, making it a strange, synchronized, and deeply unsanitary dance. The process was physically demanding, and the exposure to the ammonia and other bodily byproducts must have taken a toll on their health, not to mention the constant skin contact. Like tanneries, fulling mills, or fulling stocks as they were sometimes called, were usually located near a water source, often a river, which also helped with waste disposal. Just dump it in the river, because why not? The stench would still carry, of course, announcing the presence of the fullers to anyone downwind. Fulling was a necessary step in producing quality wool cloth, which was a major industry in medieval Europe. Without the fullers, the woolen garments that kept people warm and clothed wouldn't have been nearly as durable or as comfortable. It's another one of those jobs where the essential nature of the work completely overshadowed the truly vile conditions. The next time you appreciate the warmth of a wool sweater, you can cast a little thought to the barefoot fullers, treading their way through vats of urine, all in the name of a better textile. It's a testament to human resilience, or perhaps just a testament to the lack of better options, that people willingly engaged in such tasks. We're only just beginning to scratch the surface of these not-so-glamorous medieval livelihoods. It's a rather sobering reminder that life back then wasn't all grand feasts and chivalric quests. For most, it was a daily grind, often in conditions we'd find utterly unthinkable today.
Let's float back to the physical world and consider the rat catcher. Now, in a world where the Black Death was always just one flea bite away, you'd think the rat catcher would be a celebrated hero. But mostly they were just guys covered in bites, scratches, and a very specific kind of grime. Their job was to crawl into the tightest, filthiest corners of the city to hunt down vermin. They didn't have fancy traps. Often they used a small terrier or a ferret, but mostly it was just their own hands and a big sack. They would catch the rats, often by the tail, and kill them. Some rat catchers would even keep the rats alive to sell to rat baiting pits, where people would bet on how fast a dog could kill 100 rats, because apparently medieval entertainment was just as questionable as medieval medicine. The rat catcher was constantly exposed to every disease known to man, from leptospirosis to the plague itself. They were a walking hazard, perpetually surrounded by a swarm of angry, biting rodents. And then there was the lime burner. This job was a slow-motion disaster for the human body. Lime was essential for making mortar and plaster, and it was produced by heating limestone in massive kilns. The process created quicklime, a highly caustic substance. The lime burner had to spend all day in a cloud of fine white dust that reacted with any moisture it touched. If the dust got in your eyes, you went blind. If you inhaled it, it started to burn the lining of your lungs. If you sweated, and you were standing next to a giant kiln, so you definitely sweated, the dust would turn into a caustic paste on your skin, causing chemical burns. It was a job that literally ate you alive while you worked. Most lime burners had chronic respiratory issues and skin that looked like it had been through a cheese grater. It was a quiet, dusty, agonizing way to spend a life, contributing to the beautiful cathedrals and castles that we admire today, while the workers themselves slowly dissolved.
Finally, for this stretch of our journey, let's consider the catgut maker. No, it wasn't actually made from cats, usually. It was mostly sheep or goat intestines. But the name stuck, perhaps because it sounded more exotic than sheep innard stretcher. The process involved taking the long, wet strings of guts, cleaning them of all fecal matter and residual fat, and then soaking them in, you guessed it, alkaline solutions to bleach them. The workers would then have to stretch these slippery, slimy tubes over long distances to dry them out, twisting them into tight cords that would eventually become violin strings or lute strings. The smell of wet, decaying gut tissue is a very specific kind of nasal assault. It's a long, tedious, and incredibly wet job. You were essentially elbow deep in the digestive tracts of animals for 12 hours a day, so that a minstrel could play a jaunty tune at a feast. Whenever you hear a delicate harp melody in a period drama, just remember the man who had to spend his Tuesday scraping the slime off 50 feet of sheep intestine to make it possible. Chapter 4. The Damp and the Dusty. Let's move our heavy, tired feet toward the outskirts of the village, where the ground turns into a permanent marsh of grayish sludge. We're arriving at the workplace of the flax dresser. Now, flax is a lovely plant. It gives us linen, which is breathable, elegant, and much nicer against the skin than itchy wool. But before it becomes a shirt fit for a nobleman, it has to go through a process called retting. And retting is just a fancy medieval word for letting things rot in a pond until they smell like a swamp's digestive system. The flax stalks would be submerged in stagnant water for weeks. The goal was to rot away the woody outer shell so the useful fibers could be extracted. The smell of rotting vegetation in standing water is a thick, sickly sweet perfume that clings to your lungs. The flax dresser had to wade into this fermented soup to haul the sodden, slimy stalks out. Once they were out, the real fun began. The stalks had to be beaten and scutched, which released a cloud of fine, sharp vegetable dust into the air. This dust was notorious for causing poultry lung, a chronic cough that made the flax dresser sound like they were constantly trying to expel a small bird from their chest.
It was a slow, wheezing existence, turning rot into refinement, one cough at a time. While we're discussing things that are far too dusty for comfort, let's float over to the miller. You might picture a jolly man with a white hat, but the medieval miller was often the most hated man in town. Why? Because he was suspected of stealing a bit of everyone's grain, and because he was perpetually covered in a fine white powder that made him look like a ghost. But that powder wasn't just on him, it was in him. Miller's lung was a very real thing. Inhaling flour dust all day, every day, eventually turns the inside of your lungs into a sort of uncooked sourdough paste. It's hard to breathe when your respiratory system is essentially a bakery. Furthermore, mills were incredibly dangerous. A spark from the grindstones hitting a bit of grit could ignite the flour dust in the air, causing a massive explosion. Or, more commonly, a sleeve could get caught in the massive wooden gears, and suddenly the miller was part of the mash. It was a life of constant noise, the rhythmic, mind-numbing thump-thump of the stones, and the slow, silent accumulation of flour in the blood. Let's descend into the dark, damp earth to visit the salt boiler. Salt was the white gold of the medieval world. Without it, you couldn't preserve meat, which meant you'd starve in the winter. In places with salt springs, the salt boiler's job was to stand over enormous lead pans of bubbling brine, stoking fires that never went out. The humidity in these boiling huts was near 100%, and the air was thick with salt crystals. Imagine sweating in a room that is basically a giant steamer, while the salt in the air settles into every pore and every small cut on your skin. It was like living inside a giant boiling pretzel. The salt would crystallize on their eyelashes and in their hair. Their skin would become perpetually raw and irritated, and the constant inhalation of hot, salty steam did wonderful things to their internal organs. They were essential to the survival of the kingdom, but they lived in a literal pressure cooker, slowly pickling themselves so that the king could have salted ham in February. Finally, let's take a look at the parchment maker. If the catgut maker had it bad, the parchment maker was right there with them. Parchment is made from the skins of sheep, calves, or goats. But unlike leather, it isn't tanned, it's limed. The skins were soaked in a vat of caustic lime, that white dust we talked about earlier, to dissolve the hair and fat. The parchment maker had to reach into these vats with bare arms to pull out the slippery, gelatinous skins. Once out, the skin was stretched tight on a wooden frame called a hearse. Then came the shaving. The worker used a curved knife called a lunellum to scrape away the remaining flesh and gunk. If they scraped too hard, they ruined the skin. If they didn't scrape enough, the monk who eventually bought it would have to write over a bit of leftover sheep fat. It was a wet, smelly, physically exhausting process. The smell of wet skin and caustic lime is enough to make anyone's eyes water, but the result was the smooth, creamy surface that holds our history. Every beautiful, illuminated manuscript was once a slimy, stinking mess in the hands of a man who just wanted his hands to stop stinging. Chapter 5. The Weight of the Grime. Let's drift back toward the city walls and consider the plight of the charcoal burner. This wasn't a job for the social butterfly. It was a lonely, soot-stained existence out in the deep woods. Charcoal was the essential fuel for smithing and smelting, but making it was a slow-motion test of patience and lung capacity. The burner would stack wood in huge, precise mounds, cover them with turf and soil to keep oxygen out, and then set them to smolder. For days or even weeks, the burner had to stay with the pile, watching the smoke. If the fire broke through the soil, the wood would turn to ash instead of charcoal, and a week's work would literally go up in smoke. This meant sleeping in a tiny hut right next to a pile of smoldering timber, breathing in carbon monoxide and fine black soot 24 hours a day. By the time a charcoal burner came into town to sell his wares, he didn't just have dirty hands, he was saturated in black dust. It was in his pores, his eyes, and his throat. He was a shadow moving through a world of light, a man whose very breath was a reminder of the slow, suffocating heat of the pits. Speaking of shadows, let's look at the chimney sweep, specifically the climbing boys of the slightly later medieval and early modern periods. While chimneys were a luxury at first, as they became more common, so did the need to keep them from catching fire. Since adults generally lacked the skeletal flexibility to slide down a narrow stone tube, the job fell to small children. These kids were essentially human brushes. They would be sent up into the dark, suffocating vertical tunnels to scrape away the creosote and soot with their bare hands and small scrapers. The physical toll was horrific. Their knees and elbows would be rubbed raw against the brickwork, and the sores would be toughened by their masters with salt and vinegar, because why use bandages when you can use agony? They breathed in nothing but soot, leading to a lifetime of respiratory failure if they survived the job at all. There was even a specific type of cancer associated with the trade, caused by the constant contact with carcinogenic soot. It was a dark, cramped, and terrifying way to spend a childhood. Also, a wealthy merchant could have a draft-free living room. Then we have the dyer. Now, who doesn't love a vibrant blue or a deep, rich red? In the medieval world, color was status. But the dyer's vat was a place of chemical warfare. To get the dyes to stick to the fabric, you needed a mordant, and the most common mordant was, once again, our favorite medieval recurring guest, stale urine. The dyer spent his day leaning over steaming vats of fermented pea and crushed insects or rotted grants. If you were working with woad to make blue dye, the smell was so offensive that Queen Elizabeth I eventually banned the processing of woad within 5 miles of her palaces. It smelled like a combination of a stable and a corpse. The dyer's hands were perpetually stained, often permanently, leading to them being known as blue nails. They were literally marked by their trade, walking around with neon-colored limbs that announced their proximity to a vat of ammonia and rot from a mile away. Let's not forget the scullery maid. While the knights were feasting on roasted swan in the Great Hall, the scullery maid was in the damp, dark basement of the kitchen, engaging in a never-ending war with grease. There were no sponges or dish soap. Instead, she used scouring sand, wood ash, and sheer elbow grease to clean massive iron cauldrons that had layers of burnt fat and gristle baked onto them. Her hands were constantly wet, cold, and cracked from the lye in the wood ash. She spent her entire life bent over a stone sink, inhaling the smell of rancid fat and damp stone. It was a repetitive, soul-crushing cycle of scrubbing things that would just be dirty again in 4 hours. She was the invisible engine of the castle, the one who ensured that the glamour of the medieval feast didn't end in mass food poisoning. Yet she was usually the lowest paid and least regarded person in the entire household. Finally, consider the tallow chandler. We touched on the soap maker, but the chandler, the candle maker, was his brother in stench. Most people couldn't afford beeswax candles. They used tallow, which was rendered animal fat. The chandler would spend his days melting down the suet of cows and sheep. The smell was thick, oily, and nauseating. He would dip wicks of hemp or cotton into the vats of liquid fat over and over again until the candle was thick enough. These candles didn't just smell bad while they were being made. They smelled like a frying pan full of old hair when they were burned. They produced a smoky, dim light and dripped hot, smelly grease everywhere. The chandler's life was one of perpetual greasiness. Everything he touched was slick with animal fat, and the air in his shop was so heavy with lipids you could practically chew it. It was a dark, cramped, and terrifying way to spend a childhood, all so a wealthy merchant could have a draft-free living room. Then we have the mudlark. Now, in the later centuries, mudlarking became a bit of a hobby for the desperate, but in the medieval period, it was a grueling, filthy necessity. These individuals, often children or the elderly, would wait for the tide of the river to go out, revealing the thick, sucking gray mud of the banks. Then they would wade into this cold, gelatinous sludge, often up to their knees, to scavenge for anything of value. They were looking for dropped coins, bits of metal, or discarded scraps of bone and wood. But you have to remember what else was in that mud. The river was the city's primary sewer. Everything from the contents of the Gong Farmer's barrels to the offal from the butcher's stalls ended up in that water. To be a mudlark was to spend your day sifting through a liquid graveyard of urban filth. The mud was often filled with broken glass, rusted nails, and the sharp bones of drowned livestock, meaning the mudlark's feet and hands were constantly covered in small, festering cuts. It was a slow, hunched-over existence, digging through the city's refuse in hopes of finding enough copper to buy a single loaf of bread. While we're near the water, let's consider the waterman. On the surface, rowing people across a river sounds almost romantic, but the Thames in London or the Seine in Paris were not the picturesque waterways of a travel brochure. They were clogged with debris and smelled like a fermented bog. The waterman had to navigate this sludge daily, his clothes perpetually damp with spray that was, to put it mildly, biologically active. The physical strain on the back and shoulders was immense, but the real challenge was the sensory assault. On a hot summer day, the river would turn, and the gases bubbling up from the decomposing layers of muck on the bottom would be enough to make the sturdiest rower lightheaded.
Moving back into the dense heart of the city, let's talk about the link boy. This was a job born out of the absolute pitch-black darkness of a medieval night. There were no streetlights, and if you were a person of means trying to navigate the narrow, waste-filled alleys, you hired a link boy to carry a torch, a link, ahead of you. The torch was usually made of resin, pitch, and tow, a mixture that produced a thick, choking black smoke. The link boy spent his night running through the streets, holding this sputtering, dripping flame aloft. He was constantly showered in hot sparks and sticky, burning resin. He inhaled the toxic fumes of the pitch for hours on end. And, because he was leading people through the worst parts of town, he was often the first person to step into a fresh pile of night soil or trip over a discarded carcass. It was a life of perpetual soot and minor burns, a tiny, flickering light in a world that was otherwise dark, damp, and dangerous. Then there was the fletcher's apprentice. Making arrows sounds clean enough, doesn't it? It's just wood and feathers. But to attach those feathers, the fletching, you needed glue. Medieval glue was not a tidy substance from a plastic bottle. It was hide glue, made by boiling down the ears, tails, and scrapings of horses and cows until they turned into a thick, sticky, foul-smelling gelatin. The apprentice's job was to keep this glue pot simmering. The smell of boiling connective tissue is a heavy, cloying scent that sticks to the back of your throat and never truly leaves. Everything in the workshop was covered in a thin, tacky film. The apprentice would spend his day with his fingers coated in this animal-derived sludge, carefully positioning feathers while the steam from the glue pot turned the air into a humid, stinking mist. It was a job of precision, yes, but it was a precision performed in a cloud of olfactory misery. Finally, for this leg of our journey, let's look at the barber's assistant. Specifically, the one tasked with the disposal. After the barber-surgeon had finished his bloodletting or his lancing of boils, there was a significant amount of biological waste to be dealt with. The assistant had to collect the bowls of blood and the piles of pus-soaked bandages. In many cities, the solution was simply to carry these bowls to the nearest window or door and toss them into the street gutter. It was a job of constant exposure to infection. They were the ones scrubbing the blood-stained chairs and floorboards with nothing but vinegar and sand. They lived in the aftermath of pain, perpetually cleaning up the fluids that the medieval world believed were the source of all illness, never realizing that they were putting themselves at the center of a very different kind of danger.
It's a quiet, rhythmic sort of grossness, the slosh of the bucket, the scrub of the brush, and the smell of copper and rot. Chapter 7. The Alchemy of the Awful. Let's float over to the outskirts of a medieval village, where the air is thick with a sharp, stinging vapor that makes your eyes water before you even see the source. Here, we encounter the saltpeter man. This was a job combined the legal authority of a tax collector with the lifestyle of a professional scavenger. Saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, was the key ingredient in gunpowder. And where do you find concentrated nitrogen in a world without chemical plants? In the most concentrated sources of organic waste, of course. The saltpeter man was legally entitled to dig up the floors of stables, barns, and even people's private homes. In an era where many houses had dirt floors covered in rushes that were rarely changed and frequently served as the family dog's favorite spot, the soil underneath became saturated with nitrates from years of accumulated urine and manure. The saltpeter man would arrive, essentially seize your living room, and begin digging up the earth. He would then take this nitrogen-rich soil and put it through a process of leaching, which involved mixing the dirt with ashes and, predictably, more urine, then letting it sit in vats until crystals formed. It was a job that required you to be perpetually elbow-deep in the most matured dirt imaginable. He was the man who turned your floorboards into explosives, and he smelled exactly like you'd expect a man who harvests crystallized urine to smell. Let's transition away from the floor and into the pantry, though you might wish we hadn't. We must talk about the ale conner. This sounds like a dream job, a professional beer taster. But in the medieval world, the ale conner wasn't just there to enjoy a cold pint. He was a public health official and a quality controller. One of the ways they tested the quality of the ale was by its sugar content. According to legend, and historical accounts vary on how literally this was practiced, the ale conner would wear leather breeches. He would pour a small amount of the ale onto a wooden bench and then sit in it. He would remain seated for a set amount of time, perhaps long enough to finish a conversation, and then he would try to stand up. If his leather breeches stuck to the bench, it meant there was too much unfermented sugar in the beer, implying the brewer had cut corners or produced a subpar batch. Imagine spending your professional life with a perpetually sticky, beer-soaked backside, sitting on benches in crowded taverns just to see if your pants would fuse to the wood. It was a life of damp, sugary discomfort, all to ensure the village didn't get a bad batch of small beer. Let's drift back toward the more visceral side of city life with the offal tosser. In every major medieval city, there were shambles, or open-air butcher stalls. When animals were slaughtered and butchered on site, there was an enormous amount of waste that couldn't be sold, the offal. The offal tosser's job was to collect this mountain of slippery, bloody waste and transport it to the common privy, or more often, a designated dung bridge where it could be dumped into the river. This wasn't a job of involving a clean cart and shovel. It was a job of manual handling. They were often covered in the contents of burst stomachs and the metallic-smelling fluids of the slaughterhouse. The offal tosser lived in a world of constant fresh decay, a person whose very presence was marked by the flies that followed him in a buzzing, dark cloud. While we're discussing waste, let's consider the gold finder. This is another wonderfully ironic name for a truly terrible job. In the late medieval period and into the Tudor era, gold finders were the men who cleaned out the vaults or deep cesspits beneath the homes of the wealthy. They were called gold finders because occasionally they would find jewelry or coins that had accidentally been dropped down the privy.
But for every gold ring they found, they shoveled through tons of human waste. They worked in teams, usually at night, descending into pits that were sometimes 15 or 20 feet deep. One man would stay at the top with a windlass and a bucket, while the finder would be down in the dark, breathing in the heavy, warm gases of the pit. It was a job of total immersion. They would often come out of the pit literally coated from head to toe, their skin stained and their hair matted. They were the ultimate invisible workers, ensuring the palaces of the elite didn't become uninhabitable, while they themselves lived in a state of permanent biological saturation. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the wool sorter. It sounds domestic, doesn't it? Sorting soft wool. But medieval wool wasn't the clean, processed stuff you buy in a craft store. It came straight off the sheep, which meant it was caked in suint, sheep sweat, lanolin, dried mud, and, most dangerously, sheep feces. The wool sorter worked in a room filled with floating particles of wool dust. This dust often carried the spores of anthrax, which was common in livestock. This led to wool sorter's disease, a particularly nasty form of inhalation anthrax that was almost always fatal. They would spend their days leaning over massive piles of greasy, stinking wool, breathing in the very things that were killing them, all while their hands became slick with the yellow, waxy discharge of the sheep's skin. It was a slow, quiet, and incredibly dusty way to meet one's end, turning the raw harvest of the fields into the softest of fabrics at the cost of their own breath. Chapter 8. The Silt and the Sinew. Let's drift down to the very edge of the medieval docklands, where the land and the water blur into a gray, indistinguishable sludge. Here we find the shoreman. While the mudlark was a scavenger of opportunity, the shoreman was a scavenger of necessity, tasked specifically with the clearing of the slips. You see, medieval ports were magnets for every bit of floating detritus: dead cats, spoiled grain, timber coated in shipworm, and the occasional unidentifiable lump of butcher's waste. When the tide went out, all this flotsam would settle into the thick black silt of the docks. The shoreman's job was to rake through this semi-liquid mess to ensure the boats didn't get stuck in a rising mound of garbage. He worked in a world of damp, heavy cold, his boots constantly leaking, and his skin perpetually pruned by the brackish, sewage-laden water. It was a rhythmic, back-breaking labor of pulling a heavy iron rake through the muck, a task that never ended because the tide, much like the city's ability to produce trash, never stopped. Moving away from the water's edge and back into the narrow, overhanging streets, we encounter the pig sticker's assistant. Now, we've talked about the offal tosser who cleaned up the mess, but the assistant was there for the wet work. In many medieval towns, pigs were the primary waste management system. They roamed the streets eating whatever was thrown out of windows, but eventually those pigs had to be turned into bacon. The assistant's job was to hold the animal, a terrified, thrashing, 300-pound muscle of a creature, while the sticker did his work. This meant being showered in a warm, metallic spray of blood several times a day. But it wasn't just the blood. Pigs are famously expressive when they are stressed. The assistant would spend his shift covered in a cocktail of mud, porcine excrement, and gore. There were no aprons that could stop the saturation. By midday, he would be a walking biohazard, smelling of the farmyard and the slaughterhouse in equal nauseating measure. It was a job that required brute strength and a total disconnection from one's sense of smell. Let's float over to a more industrial but no less fragrant profession, the glue boiler. We touched on the Fletcher using glue, but the person who made it lived in a special kind of purgatory. The glue boilery was always located as far downwind as possible. The process involved taking everything that was too far gone for the tanner or the bone grinder. Think hooves, ears, snouts, and connective tissue that had been sitting in the sun for a few days, and boiling it in massive open cauldrons. The steam rising from these vats was a thick yellow miasma of concentrated protein decay. It was so potent it could turn the silver in a person's pocket black within hours. The glue boiler had to stand over these vats, stirring the gelatinous soup with long wooden poles. The heat was immense, the humidity was stifling, and the smell was something that didn't just hit your nose, it felt like a physical weight on your chest.
They were the ultimate recyclers, turning the absolute dregs of the animal kingdom into the adhesive that held the medieval world together, but they did so in a cloud of olfactory despair that few could endure for long. Then there was the night watchman's scourer. This was a subclass of city worker whose job was to clean the piss pots of the public watch stations. In the larger cities, the night watch had designated areas to stand, and because human nature is what it is, these areas frequently became impromptu latrines. The scourer would arrive in the early hours of the morning, armed with a bucket of sand and a stiff brush. He had to scrub the stone walls and the cobbles to remove the dried, crystalline remains of the night's revelry. It was a constant kneeling in damp corners, inhaling the sharp, stinging scent of ammonia that had been baked into the stone by the previous day's sun. He was the one who made the city presentable for the morning markets, erasing the evidence of the night's indiscretions with nothing but grit and a very tired back. Finally, let's consider the vellum stretcher. If the parchment maker had a rough time, the vellum stretcher was the one who dealt with the most delicate and therefore most frustrating stage of the process. Vellum is made from the skin of unborn or newborn calves, which makes it incredibly thin and soft. But because it's so thin, it's incredibly difficult to clean. The stretcher had to take these translucent wet membranes and pin them to frames using pippins, small smooth stones wrapped in the skin itself so the tacks wouldn't tear the delicate surface. As the skin dried, it would shrink and tighten with a tension that could snap a man's finger if he wasn't careful. The stretcher had to constantly adjust the tension, leaning over the wet, milky-smelling skins for hours. The air in the workshop was kept deliberately humid so the skins wouldn't crack, creating a house environment that smelled of raw veal and damp lime. It was a job of extreme patience and wet discomfort, producing the canvas for the world's most beautiful books from a pile of slippery biological leftovers.
Chapter 9. The Sump and the Slag. Let's drift back toward the industrial edges of the medieval town, where the sky is a permanent shade of bruised purple from the constant fires. Here, we find the iron smelter's ladle-bearer. While the master smith gets the songs and the legends about forging magical swords, the ladle-bearer gets the heat and the lung rot. His job was to stand near the base of the furnace, catching the molten slag and iron as it flowed out like liquid sun. The air around a medieval furnace wasn't just hot, it was thick with furnace damp and a fine metallic grit that coated the back of the throat. The ladle-bearer spent his shift in a state of permanent dehydration, his skin scorched by the infrared heat and his eyes perpetually bloodshot from the stinging smoke. He had to move with a rhythmic, heavy grace, carrying a vessel of liquid fire that could melt through his boots in a heartbeat. It was a life lived in the orange glow of the pits, a slow, sweaty march toward a premature old age marked by the wheeze and skin that felt like dried parchment. Moving away from the heat and back into the damp shadows of the domestic world, let's consider the laundress's lye maker. We often think of medieval laundry as a group of cheerful women scrubbing clothes by a stream. The reality was a bit more chemical. To get the grease and stains out of heavy wool and linen, you needed lye. And to make lye, the assistant had to process white ash from the hearths and mix it with, you guessed it, aged urine. The lye maker's job was to filter this caustic mixture through straw and baskets. The liquid was so powerful it would eat the skin off your knuckles and turn your fingernails yellow and brittle. The lye maker spent her day over steaming vats of this bucking solution, inhaling the sharp, acrid fumes that smelled like a burnt forest and a neglected stable. It was a wet, stinging, and deeply unglamorous role. She was the one who ensured the Lord's shirts were white, while her own hands were a map of chemical burns and cracked, weeping sores. Then there was the lamp oil presser. In a world before electricity or petroleum, lighting came from plants or animals.
The presser worked in a dark, slick room where seeds like rape or flax, or sometimes fish livers, were crushed under massive stone weights to extract their oil. The floor was a permanent slip and slide of greasy residue. The smell of crushed, rotting fish or fermented seeds was so pervasive that the presser could be smelled long before he was seen. He spent his life in a state of perpetual oiliness. His clothes were so saturated with lipids that they were practically waterproof and also highly flammable. It was a slow, heavy existence, moving weights and scraping sludge in a dim, slippery world, providing the fuel that allowed the scholars to read their books, while he himself lived in an olfactory nightmare. Let's float toward the more unfortunate side of medieval urban planning, the kennel raker. In many large households and castles, packs of hunting hounds were kept in large stone kennels. These dogs were fed raw meat and offal, and, as dogs do, they produced a significant amount of waste. The kennel raker was to go into these cramped, loud, and aggressive spaces to scrape the stone floors. He wasn't just dealing with mud, he was dealing with the wash of dozens of large animals kept in close quarters. The smell of wet dog, raw meat, and old waste was concentrated into a pungent, humid fog. The raker was constantly at risk of being bitten or knocked over by the hounds, and he spent his day bent double, raking the slurry into a central drain that almost always clogged. It was a noisy, messy, and deeply unthankless task, ensuring the king's prized hounds lived in better conditions than the man cleaning up after them. Finally, for this stretch of our journey, let's look at the fuller's earth digger. We know the fuller used urine to clean cloth, but they also used fuller's earth, a type of clay that absorbs grease. The diggers had to descend into narrow, unstable pits to extract this clay. These pits were often damp and prone to collapse, and the clay itself was heavy and cloying. The digger spent his life in a subterranean world of gray-green mud. Every time he swung his pick, a fine spray of silty clay would coat his face and fill his nostrils. When he came out of the pit, he looked like a statue made of wet earth. The clay would dry on his skin, drawing out all the moisture and leaving it cracked and painful. It was a slow, suffocating job, pulling the grease-absorbing mud from the belly of the earth so that someone else could stand in a vat of pee and make a cloak. It's the perfect medieval cycle. One person digs the dirt so someone else can use it to clean the filth, and nobody involved gets to be actually clean. Chapter 10. The Muck and the Marrow. Let's drift further down the social ladder, past the merchants and the artisans, until we reach the damp, flickering shadows of the castle's lowest levels. Here, we find the spatula bearer to the physician, essentially the man whose job was to curate the apothecary's more questionable ingredients. You see, medieval medicine wasn't just about herbs and prayers, it was about sympathic magic and the use of truly bizarre biological substances. The assistant was tasked with gathering and processing things like mummy powder, which was often just ground-up bits of any old sun-dried remains found in a crypt, or the moss from the skull of a hanged man. This meant the assistant spent a fair amount of time in places people generally avoided, like gallows or damp ossuaries, scraping lichen off old bones. He then had to grind these ingredients into a fine paste using a mortar and pestle. The smell was a dry, ancient dust that tasted of copper and thyme. He lived in a world of morbid curiosities, surrounded by jars of tickled organs and dried animal parts, ensuring the doctor had all the essential rot needed to treat a nobleman's gout. Moving from the doctor's cabinet to the very walls of the city, let's consider the wall salter. Medieval stone walls, especially those in damp climates, had a tendency to develop a white crusty bloom known as efflorescence. To the medieval mind, this was a valuable resource because it was a source of nitrates. The wall salter's job was to spend his day with a small scraper and a bucket, meticulously flaking this salty crust off the damp stones of bridges, dungeons, and city gates. It was a job performed in the shadows, often in the narrow, airless gaps between buildings. The dust he scraped was caustic and irritating to the lungs, and the constant repetitive scraping motion was a slow, rhythmic torture for the joints. He was essentially harvesting the sweat of the city's architecture, a task so tedious and minuscule that it makes one wonder how anyone stayed awake while doing it, which I suppose is exactly the vibe we're going for tonight.
Let's float over to the kitchens again, but this time look at the turnspit dog's keeper. Now, the turnspit dog was a specific breed, long-bodied and short-legged, bred for the sole purpose of running inside a wooden wheel to turn the roasting meat over the fire. But someone had to manage these dogs. The keeper's life was one of constant noise and heat. He worked in the hottest part of the kitchen, right next to the roaring hearth, making sure the dogs didn't stop running. If a dog got tired or stubborn, the keeper might be tempted to put a hot coal in the wheel to keep it moving, a practice that was as cruel as it was common. The keeper himself was perpetually covered in dog hair, soot, and the splattering fat from the roasting carcasses. The smell was a heavy mix of scorched meat and stressed animal, and the repetitive clack, clack, clack of the dog's paws in the wheel provided a hypnotic, albeit miserable, soundtrack to his 12-hour shift. Then there was the eel walloper. In medieval London and other river cities, eels were a staple food for the poor. They were caught in huge numbers, but before they could be sold or cooked, they had to be processed. This involved the walloper taking a bag of live, slimy, wriggling eels and basically beating them against a stone slab to stun or kill them. The job was incredibly wet and incredibly slippery. The eel slime, a thick mucus-like substance the fish produce when stressed, would coat the walloper from head to toe. It's a substance that is notoriously difficult to wash off and has a fishy, muddy scent that lingers for days. He spent his day in a rhythmic cycle of thwack, scrape, thwack, surrounded by thousands of twisting gray bodies. It was a job of pure, repetitive motion, performed in a cold, damp environment that left the skin pruned and the nose permanently offended by the scent of river mud and fish guts. Finally, let's look at the parchment scraper's apprentice. We've talked about making parchment, but what about when you wanted to reuse it? Vellum was expensive, so old manuscripts were often recycled by scraping off the old ink to create a palimpsest. The apprentice would spend hours hunched over a desk, using a sharp pumice stone or a fine blade to meticulously grind away the prayers or ledgers of the previous century. This created a fine parchment and ink dust that he inhaled with every breath. It was a silent, dusty, and incredibly slow job. He was literally erasing history to make room for new taxes or grocery lists. His eyes would strain in the dim light, and his fingers would become calloused from the constant pressure of the stone. It was a life of quiet erasure, turning the thoughts of the dead into a cloud of white powder, just so someone could write something new on a piece of dead calf skin. Chapter 11. The Sediment of the Streets. Let's drift away from the scratching of the parchment and out toward the city's drainage ditches, where we find the kennel sweeper. Now, in a medieval sense, a kennel wasn't just for dogs. It was the name for the open gutter that ran down the center or the sides of a street. Because there was no underground sewage system, everything, and I mean everything, was tossed out of the overhanging timber windows and into these shallow stone channels. The kennel sweeper's job was to keep the flow moving. Imagine a slow-moving, viscous river of kitchen slop, horse manure, and the contents of various chamber pots, all congealing into a thick black sludge. The sweeper had to use a heavy broom of birch twigs to push this mass toward the nearest river or stagnant pool. It was a job of constant rhythmic splashing. Every stroke of the broom sent a fine mist of urban juice into the air and onto the sweeper's legs. On a rainy day, the task was frantic as the gutters overflowed. On a hot day, the sludge would bake into a crust that had to be chipped away. It was a life lived at the ground level, staring into the very worst of humanity's daily leavings, ensuring that the street didn't become a permanent swamp of filth. Moving from the center of the street to the very bottom of the city's infrastructure, let's consider the well cleaner. This was a job for the small and the brave, or perhaps just the desperately hungry. Medieval wells were often narrow, deep, and prone to contamination. If a bucket broke and fell to the bottom, or if a small animal drowned in the water, or if the silt just got too high, someone had to go down there. The well cleaner would be lowered on a fraying rope into a dark, damp, and claustrophobic shaft. As he descended, the temperature would drop and the air would grow thin. He had to stand in waist-deep, freezing water, shoveling out the rotting debris and cold mud into a bucket. The risk of the walls collapsing or the oxygen simply running out was a constant, quiet threat. He was a man suspended between the world of the living and the cold, dark belly of the earth, working in total silence except for the drip-drop of water and the sound of his own heavy breathing. Let's float over to a job that was more about the process than the result, the tallow renderer's ladle boy. We know the candle makers used tallow, but before it reached them, the raw fat had to be rendered. This happened in massive, soot-blackened vats where the fatty tissues of slaughtered animals were boiled down to separate the pure grease from the cracklings or bits of gristle. The ladle boy's job was to stand over the steaming cauldron, skim off the impurities, and stir the bubbling mass to prevent it from burning. The heat from the furnace combined with the heavy, oily steam to create an environment where you didn't just smell the fat, you wore it. It settled in your hair, on your eyelashes, and inside your lungs. The smell of boiling suet is a thick, cloying sweetness that can make a person lose their appetite for a lifetime. He was a creature of the grease, moving in a dim, slippery world where every surface was coated in a layer of yellow animal lard.
Then there was the cinder sifter. In a world where coal and wood were the only sources of heat, the piles of ash and cinders produced by a large city were mountainous. The sifter's job was to go through these heaps of gray dust to find clinkers, bits of unburnt fuel that could be sold back to the poor or to industrial workshops. The sifter lived in a permanent cloud of fine gray powder. His skin, his clothes, and even the whites of his eyes were stained by the ash. It was a job of extreme boredom and respiratory ruin. He would spend his day shaking a wire sieve, watching the dust rise in a choking veil, all to find a few handfuls of charred wood. He was a ghost in the making, a man whose presence was marked by a dry, hacking cough and a trail of gray footprints, scavenging the literal remains of yesterday's fires to survive today. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the tripe washer. Tripe is the lining of a cow's stomach, and in the medieval world, it was a common food for those who couldn't afford the prime cuts. But a cow's stomach is, by design, a very messy place. The tripe washer's job was to take the raw, green, and heavily scented organ and turn it into something edible. This involved hours of scrubbing the honeycomb texture of the stomach lining in cold water, using lime or vinegar to bleach away the remaining traces of the cow's last meal. The smell of raw, unwashed stomach is a potent reminder of the biological reality of digestion. The washer's hands were perpetually cold and wrinkled, and the workspace was a sea of gray, rubbery tissue. It was a job of relentless scrubbing and rinsing, a slow, wet labor that turned one of nature's most functional and most disgusting organs into a pale, tasteless rubber that would eventually be boiled into a soup. Chapter 12. The Marrow and the Mire.
Let's drift away from the butcher's stall and toward the outskirts of the medieval town, where the ground is littered with the jagged remnants of the feast. Here we encounter the haggler of the bone heap. While we've spoken of the bone grinder who pulverized the remains, the haggler was the one who performed the initial, much more visceral sorting. Imagine a field of sun-bleached carcasses and discarded joints from the local inns. The haggler's job was to sit amongst this skeletal landscape and manually strip away the collop, the bits of stubborn, dried connective tissue and rancid marrow that the dogs had missed. He used a small, dull knife to scrape the periosteum from the bone, collecting these scraps into jars to be sold as the base for cheap grayish soups or as grease for wagon wheels. The smell wasn't the sharp rot of fresh death, but the heavy, cloying scent of ancient oxidized fat. It was a slow, rhythmic scraping, the sound of metal on calcium, performed in a landscape of ribs and femurs. He lived in a world of white and yellow, his hands perpetually slick with the waxy residue of long-dead livestock. Moving from the fields to the very foundations of the city's stone structures, let's consider the mortar mixer's apprentice. We've talked about the lime burner, but once that caustic white powder was produced, someone had to turn it into the paste of the gods. The apprentice's job was to stand over a large wooden trough, mixing quicklime with sand, water, and, because medieval engineering loved a bit of biological reinforcement, horsehair and ox blood. The chemical reaction of the lime and water produced a terrifying amount of heat. The trough would hiss and spit like a living thing. The apprentice had to stir this bubbling, caustic slurry for hours. The steam carried fine particles of lime that would settle in his nostrils and mouth, turning his saliva into a gritty, alkaline paste. By the end of the day, his skin wasn't just dirty, it was chemically altered, feeling tight and ready to crack like the very walls he was helping to build. It was a life of white dust and gray sludge, a slow, burning labor that left the worker as brittle as a dried brick. Let's float over to a job that was as quiet as it was sickening, the leech purge. We know the collectors who waded into the bogs, but once the leeches were used by the physician, they were full. A leech can take months to digest a meal of blood, and a physician couldn't wait that long to reuse his equipment. The assistant's job was to purge the leeches. This involved dipping the bloated, slimy worms into a concentrated salt solution, or squeezing them manually from tail to head to force them to vomit up the blood they had just consumed. The assistant spent his day, his hands in jars of cold, bloody water, surrounded by the smell of copper and salt. The leeches would often latch on to the assistant's fingers in a desperate attempt to replace their lost meal, leading to a constant cycle of tiny, bleeding wounds. It was a delicate, repetitive, and deeply repulsive task, ensuring that the doctor's living tools were hungry enough for the next patient's appointment. Then there was the tallow wick dipper. While the master chandler managed the shop, the dipper was the one who performed the literal thousands of repetitive motions required to make one batch of cheap candles. He stood over a vat of sheep fat, holding a frame of cotton strings. He would dip, wait for the fat to congeal, and dip again and again for 12 hours. The air was so thick with lipid steam that the dipper's clothes would eventually become stiff enough to stand up on their own. The heat from the vat meant he was constantly sweating, and that sweat would mix with the settling grease to create a layer of human tallow on his own skin. It was a job of mind-numbing boredom and physical oiliness. He provided the light for the world, but he did so while living in a dim, slippery haze. His only company, the rhythmic plip-plop of cooling fat hitting the floor. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the gutter raker's sorter. When the kennel sweepers pushed the street filth into piles, the sorter was the one who had to go through those piles before they were carted away. Why? Because the city's waste was a resource. He was looking for night soil that was pure enough for farmers, or bits of discarded metal, or even rags that could be sold to the papermakers. He worked with a short-handled rake, hunched over a mound of urban decay. He lived at the level of the fly and the rat, his nose inches away from the fermenting leftovers of the entire neighborhood. It was a job of meticulous, disgusting detail. He wasn't just moving the muck, he was studying it, separating the rot from the useful rot. He was the final filter of the medieval city, a man who found his livelihood in the things everyone else had literally walked over or thrown away.
Chapter 13. The Resin and the Rancid. Let's drift away from the piles of the gutter raker and move toward the shipyards and the city gates, where the scent of the forest meets the stench of the sewer. Here we find the pitch boiler. Pitch was the lifeblood of the medieval navy and the primary sealant for everything from wooden pipes to the roofs of grand halls. But before it could be used, the raw pine resin had to be cooked down. The pitch boiler spent his days over a massive black iron cauldron, stirring a bubbling tar-like substance that was as dangerous as it was smelly. The fumes were thick and suffocating, a heavy, smoky sweetness that would coat the inside of your throat and make your lungs feel as though they were being lined with velvet. If a single drop of the boiling pitch splashed onto the boiler's skin, it didn't just burn, it bonded. It would take layers of skin with it when it was finally peeled away. He lived in a world of black soot and sticky hands, his face perpetually darkened by the oily smoke, acting as the man who made the kingdom waterproof while he himself slowly suffocated in the vapor. Moving from the cauldrons of the shipyard to the quiet, damp cellars of the wealthy, let's consider the cask scrubber. In a world where water was often a gamble, ale and wine were stored in massive wooden barrels. But wood is porous, and over time, a mother of vinegar or a layer of thick, ropey yeast would build up on the inside. The cask scrubber's job was to climb inside these narrow, dark vessels. Imagine being wedged into a curved wooden tube that still smelled of fermented grapes and stale yeast. The air inside was often depleted of oxygen and replaced with carbon dioxide from the lingering fermentation. The scrubber had to use a short, stiff brush and a bucket of sand to scour the staves until the wood was sweet again. It was a job for the small and the claustrophobic, performed in a dim world of echoes and vinegar stings, ensuring the next batch of wine didn't taste like the ghost of the previous year's harvest. Let's float over to a job that was as repetitive as it was damp, the hemp beater. Before hemp could be spun into rope or coarse cloth, the tough, fibrous stalks had to be broken down. This was done by laying the wet hemp over a stone block and hitting it repeatedly with a heavy wooden mallet. The rhythm was hypnotic: thump, splash, thump, splash. The water in the hemp was usually stagnant, having been used for retting or rotting the stalks earlier. Every strike of the mallet sent a spray of this fermented, plant-heavy water into the beater's face. The physical toll on the shoulders and wrists was immense, but the sensory toll was worse: a constant damp cold and the smell of rotting vegetable matter that seemed to seep into the very marrow of his bones. He was the man who provided the strength for the gallows rope and the ship's rigging, one soggy, exhausting blow at a time. Then there was the tallow scraper's apprentice in the royal kitchens. We've seen the tallow renderer, but the scraper had a different, perhaps more intimate relationship with grease. After a grand feast, the great roasting pits and the stone floors beneath them would be coated in a thick, cooling layer of animal fat and drippings. The apprentice's job was to crawl under the spits with a flat iron blade and scrape this congealing mess into buckets. The fat was often mixed with ash, spilled wine, and the occasional bit of charcoal. This kitchen slush was then sold back to the chandlers or used to grease the hinges of the castle gates. The apprentice spent his life on his knees in a slippery, dark world, smelling like a burnt roast
and feeling the cold, waxy grease coat his arms up to the elbows. He was the one who cleaned up the aftermath of the king's gluttony, turning the waste of a feast into the fuel for a candle. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the litter changer. In the grand houses, floors weren't scrubbed, they were covered in rushes or straw. These rushes were meant to trap the dirt, the spilled ale, and the surprises left by the household dogs. Over time, the bottom layer of the straw would begin to ferment, creating a damp, rotting mat beneath the fresh top layer. The changer's job was to pitchfork this heavy, sodden, and foul-smelling mess out of the hall. As he lifted the rushes, the smell of ammonia and old food would rise in a visible cloud. It was a constant dust and dampness performed under the feet of the nobility. He was the man who removed the aftermath of a month's worth of living, carrying the scent of the court out to the dung heap on his back, ensuring that the hall looked clean, even if it never truly smelled that way. Chapter 14. The Scum and the Solder. Let's drift away from the rotting straw of the great hall and move toward the workshops of the pewterer's apprentice. Now, pewter was the middle-class metal, nicer than wood, cheaper than silver. But the process of casting it was a long, slow exercise in heavy metal exposure. Pewter is an alloy, and in the medieval period it was heavily laden with lead. The apprentice's job was to scum the melting pot. As the metals melted together, impurities and oxidized lead would float to the surface in a gray, frothy crust called dross. The apprentice had to lean over the molten vat with a long-handled spoon, carefully skimming this metallic foam off the surface. He was breathing in concentrated lead vapors all day, every day. It didn't happen all at once, but over the years, his hands would develop a subtle tremor, and his mind would begin to feel as heavy and sluggish as the metal he stirred. It was a life of gray dust and shimmering heat, producing shiny plates for the merchant's table, while his own nervous system slowly turned to lead.
Moving from the heat of the forge to the damp, silent corners of the city, let's consider the cess raker's sieve man. When a Gong Farmer emptied a pit, the waste wasn't always just thrown away. In larger cities, it was sometimes brought to a sorting yard. The sieve man's job was to take the more liquid portions of the waste and pour them through a coarse wicker sieve. He was looking for valuables, not gold usually, but lost buttons, pins, or scraps of heavy cloth that hadn't yet rotted. He stood in a permanent mist of aerosolized waste, his task one of meticulous stomach-churning observation. Every splash of the bucket sent a reminder of his station onto his clothes and skin. It was a job of extreme patience, performed in a sensory vacuum where the only thing that mattered was the tiny clink of something solid hitting the bottom of the sieve. He was the city's last line of recovery, finding the tiny remnants of a life in the middle of a literal ocean of refuse. Let's float over to a job that was as loud as it was dusty, the fuller's stock tender. We've talked about the men who stomped in urine, but as technology progressed, some towns used water-powered stocks, massive wooden hammers that beat the wool. The tender's job was to stand in the spray of the mill, constantly repositioning the heavy, sodden, urine-soaked cloth so the hammers hit a fresh spot. The noise was a deafening, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that made the very ground shake. The air was a fine mist of fermented pea and wool fibers. The tender spent his life in a permanent state of vibration and dampness. He couldn't hear himself think, and he couldn't breathe without tasting the ammonia. He was a human gear in a massive, stinking machine, ensuring the king's soldiers had thick cloaks, while he himself lived in a world of gray noise and yellow spray. Then there was the tallow melt's ash boy. We know how the tallow was rendered, but what happened to the cracklings, the burnt bits of skin and bone left in the pot? They were often mixed with wood ash to create a primitive greasy fertilizer or a base for the cheapest soap. The ash boy's job was to take the hot, oily remains and mix them by hand with the caustic ashes from the furnace.
The heat from the cracklings would react with the ash, creating a dry, burning sensation on his skin. His hands were a constant contradiction, oily from the fat, yet dry and cracked from the lye in the ash. He spent his day hunched over a pile of gray-black sludge, breathing in a mixture of burnt protein and wood smoke. He was the recycler of the recycler, finding a use for the very last dregs of the animal kingdom in a cloud of stinging, greasy dust. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the gut string spinner. Once the catgut maker had cleaned the sheep's intestines, the spinner had to take those wet, translucent ribbons and twist them into a single uniform cord. This was done in a long, narrow rope walk where the air was kept damp to prevent the gut from snapping. The spinner would walk backwards for miles every day, twisting the slimy strings between his fingers while an apprentice turned a wheel at the other end. The friction of the twisting gut would often heat up, and the smell of warm animal tissue would fill the small, airless room. His fingers were perpetually pruned and stained by the alkaline solutions used to preserve the gut. It was a job of intense focus and wet monotony, turning the interior of a sheep into the high-tension string of a longbow or the delicate wire of a harpsichord. He was the man who provided the tension for both war and music, one slippery backward step at a time. Chapter 15. The Silt and the Solder. Let's drift away from the twisting rope walks and move toward the city's industrial periphery, specifically where the tanners and the dyers meet. Here we find the vat stirrer. While we've discussed the ingredients of the tanning and dyeing processes, the stirring was a job in itself. To ensure the hides or the fabrics were evenly saturated with urine, dog dung, or woad, the vats had to be agitated constantly. The stirrer stood on a narrow wooden plank suspended over a deep bubbling pool of liquid filth. His tool was a long, heavy oar, and his task was to churn the thick, viscous soup for hours on end. The fumes rising from the vat were a physical force, a warm, moist wall of ammonia and sulfur that would saturate his clothes within minutes. Because the plank was often slick with the very fluids he was stirring, the risk of a dip was a constant, terrifying reality. It was a life of slow, rhythmic exertion in a sensory fog, turning the paddle through the muck so that a nobleman's leather boots wouldn't have unsightly splotches. Moving from the vats to the high, windy scaffolding of a new cathedral, let's consider the lead pourer. While the glazier handled the cold lead, the pourer dealt with the molten version used to seal the massive stone blocks together or to cover the roof. He carried a small, heavy iron ladle filled with liquid lead, moving across narrow beams hundreds of feet above the ground. The danger wasn't just the height, it was the sweet taste of the lead fumes hitting the back of his throat. He worked in a constant cloud of metallic vapor that dulled the senses and slowed the heart. Every time he poured the silver-gray liquid into a joint, a small puff of toxic smoke would rise directly into his face. He was the man who made the cathedral eternal and weatherproof, while he himself became a repository of the very metal he used to protect the church. It was a silent, precarious existence, spent suspended between the heavens he was building and the gray, heavy reality of the lead. Let's float over to a job that was as quiet as it was damp, the salt panner's scraper. We've talked about the boiling of the salt, but once the water evaporated, a thick, jagged crust of salt would form on the bottom of the lead pans. The scraper's job was to climb into the still hot, humid pan and use a flat iron tool to chip away the salt.
The air in the salt hut was so saturated with minerals that the scraper's hair would literally stand on end, coated in tiny white crystals. Every small cut on his hands or legs was a sight of constant, stinging agony as the salt found its way into his bloodstream. He worked in a permanent state of pickling, his skin becoming leathery and white-streaked. He provided the flavor and the preservation for the kingdom's food, but he did so while living in a literal pressure cooker of saline misery, his only reward a constant, unquenchable thirst. Then there was the tallow melts wick trimmer. In the massive candle-making workshops, after the dipping was done, the candles were often uneven at the bottom. The trimmer's job was to take a warm blade and slice off the drips and the excess wick. He sat in a room filled with piles of waxy shavings, his task one of mindless, repetitive slicing. The room was kept warm to keep the wax pliable, which meant the smell of old sheep fat was concentrated and heavy. The trimmer's fingers were perpetually coated in a layer of yellow grease that made it impossible to grip anything else. He spent his day hunched over a bench, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 slaughtered sheep, ensuring that the candles were pretty enough for a merchant's dining table. It was a life of quiet, oily precision, performed in a world where everything felt and smelled like a Sunday roast gone wrong. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the parchment pumicer. After the parchment was scraped and dried, it was still too rough for a fine quill. The pumicer's job was to take a block of volcanic stone and rub the surface of the skin until it was as smooth as silk. This created a fine white skin dust, a mixture of dried calf cells and lime. The pumicer lived in a cloud of this powder, his eyelashes and eyebrows constantly white with the remains of the animal. Every breath he took was filled with the pulverized history of a creature that never got to grow up. It was a slow, circular motion repeated thousands of times a day, turning the raw, scraped hide into a surface worthy of a king's decree. He was the man who provided the glow of the manuscript, one dusty, rhythmic stroke at a time. Chapter 16: The Silt and the Solder. Let's drift further away from the parchment workshops and move toward the city's industrial periphery, specifically where the tanners and the dyers meet. Here we find the vat stirrer. While we've discussed the ingredients of the tanning and dyeing processes, the stirring was a job unto itself. To ensure the hides or the fabrics were evenly saturated with urine, dog dung, or woad, the vats had to be agitated constantly. The stirrers stood on a narrow wooden plank suspended over a deep, bubbling pool of filth. His tool was a long, heavy oar, and his task was to churn the thick, viscous soup for hours on end. The fumes rising from the vat were a physical force, a warm, moist wall of ammonia and sulfur that would saturate his clothes within minutes. Because the plank was often slick with the very fluids he was steering, the risk of a dip was a constant, terrifying reality. It was a life of slow, rhythmic exertion in a sensory fog, turning the cattle through the muck so that a nobleman's leather boots wouldn't have unsightly splotches. Moving from the vats to the high, windy scaffolding of a new cathedral, let's consider the lead pourer. While the glazer handled the cold lead, the pourer dealt with the molten version used to seal the massive stone blocks together or to cover the roof. He carried a small, heavy iron ladle filled with liquid lead, moving across narrow beams hundreds of feet above the ground. The danger wasn't just the height, it was the sweet taste of the lead fumes hitting the back of his throat. He worked in a constant cloud of metallic vapor that dulled the senses and slowed the heart. Every time he poured the silver-gray liquid into a joint, a small puff of toxic smoke would rise directly into his face. He was the man who made the cathedral eternal and weatherproof, while his own body became a repository for the very metal he used to protect the church. It was a silent, precarious existence, spent suspended between the heavens he was building and the gray, heavy reality of the lead. Let's float over to a job that was as quiet as it was damp, the salt panner's scraper. We've talked about the boiling of the salt, but once the water evaporated, a thick, jagged crust of salt would form on the bottom of the lead pans. The scraper's job was to climb into the still hot, humid pan and use a flat iron tool to chip away at the salt. The air in the salt hut was so saturated with minerals that the scraper's hair would literally stand on end, coated in tiny white crystals. Every small cut on his hands or legs was a sight of constant, stinging agony as the salt found its way into his bloodstream. He worked in a permanent state of pickling, his skin becoming leathery and white-streaked. He provided the flavor and the preservation for the kingdom's food, but he did so while living in a literal pressure cooker of saline misery, his only reward a constant, unquenchable thirst. Then there was the tallow melts wick trimmer. In the massive candle-making workshops, after the dipping was done, the candles were often uneven at the bottom. The trimmer's job was to take a warm blade and slice off the drips and the excess wick. He sat in a room filled with piles of waxy shavings, his task one of mindless, repetitive slicing. The room was kept warm to keep the wax pliable, which meant the smell of old sheep fat was concentrated and heavy. The trimmer's fingers were perpetually coated in a layer of yellow grease that made it impossible to grip anything else. He spent his day hunched over a bench, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 slaughtered sheep, ensuring that the candles were pretty enough for a merchant's dining table. It was a life of quiet, oily precision, performed in a world where everything felt and smelled like a Sunday roast gone wrong.
Surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 slaughtered sheep, ensuring that the candles were pretty enough for a merchant's dining table. It was a life of quiet, oily precision, performed in a world where everything felt and smelled like a Sunday roast gone wrong. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the parchment pumicer. After the parchment was scraped and dried, it was still too rough for a fine quill. The pumicer's job was to take a block of volcanic stone and rub the surface of the skin until it was as smooth as silk. This created a fine white skin dust, a mixture of dried calf cells and lime. The pumicer lived in a cloud of this powder, his eyelashes and eyebrows constantly white with the remains of the animal. Every breath he took was filled with the pulverized history of a creature that never got to grow up. It was a slow, circular motion, repeated thousands of times a day, turning the raw, scraped hide into a surface worthy of a king's decree. He was the man who provided the glow of the manuscript, one dusty, rhythmic stroke at a time. Chapter 17, The Shimmer and the Soot. Let's drift away from the dusty parchment and toward the blistering heat of the medieval glassworks. Here we meet the glass grinder. While the master blower created the crown glass, it was often thick, uneven, and filled with imperfections that distorted the light. The grinder's job was to take these cooled discs and rub them with progressively finer layers of sand and water. He sat hunched over a stone wheel for 14 hours a day. The sound was a constant, high-pitched screech, the scream of sand against glass that would eventually leave him partially deaf. But the real danger was the glass flour. As he ground the surface, tiny, microscopic shards of silica would fly into the air. He breathed them in with every breath, and these tiny needles would lodge themselves in the lining of his lungs, causing scarring that made every breath feel like he was inhaling broken needles. He provided the clear view for the astronomer and the monk, while his own vision of the world grew increasingly clouded by a permanent hacking cough. Moving from the screeching glass to the silent, suffocating depths of the earth, let's consider the sea coal miner. In coastal areas like Newcastle, coal would sometimes wash up on the beach, but eventually they had to go looking for it. The medieval mine was often just a narrow, vertical hole in the ground called a bell pit. The miner would be lowered down on a rope, armed with nothing but a pickaxe and a small tallow candle. The air was thick with choke damp, carbon dioxide, and the ever-present threat of a cave-in. He spent his life in a world of absolute blackness, broken only by the flickering, smelly light of his candle. He wasn't just dirty, he was stained. The coal dust worked its way into his skin so deeply that even a scrub with lye wouldn't remove it. He was a man of the shadows, pulling the black stone from the earth so that the iron smelters could keep their fires burning, while he himself lived in a state of perpetual subterranean twilight. Let's float back to the city, to a job that was as delicate as it was dangerous, the mercury gilder. If you wanted your bronze statue or your silver cup to look like solid gold, you called the gilder. He would mix gold filings with mercury to create a thick, buttery paste called an amalgam. He would smear this paste onto the object and then hold it over an open fire. The heat would cause the mercury to flash off as a vapor, leaving a thin, beautiful layer of gold behind. But that mercury vapor went straight into the gilder's lungs. Over time, the mercury would attack his nervous system. His teeth would loosen, his hair would fall out, and he would develop the tremors, shaking so violently he could no longer hold his tools. It was a life of shimmering beauty and internal decay, turning base metals into gold, while his own mind slowly unraveled in a cloud of toxic silver mist. Then there was the wool carder's apprentice. Before the wool could be spun, it had to be carded, brushed with 2 wooden boards covered with tiny metal hooks to align the fibers. But as we know, medieval wool was greasy and filled with suet. To make the carding easier, the apprentice would have to add wool oil, which was often just rancid butter or fish oil to the fleece. He spent his day in a room filled with floating wool hairs and the smell of rotting dairy. The constant flicking motion of the cards sent a fine spray of grease and fibers into his eyes and mouth. His hands were perpetually scratched by the metal hooks, and the wounds would frequently fester because of the bacteria in the raw wool. He was a man of the fluff, living in a humid, oily haze, ensuring the yarn was smooth, while his own skin was a map of tiny infected scars. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the potter's lead glazer. While the potter shaped the clay, the glazer made it waterproof. He would take galena, raw lead ore, and grind it into a fine powder, mixing it with water to create a slurry. He would dip the clay pots into this mixture with his bare hands, the lead water soaking into his skin and under his nails. When the pots were fired, the lead would melt into a glassy green or yellow finish. But the glazer lived in a world of heavy metal. He would eventually lose the use of his wrists, a condition known as wrist drop, and his stomach would be twisted by permanent, agonizing cramps. He made the bowls that held the village's stew, but he did so at the cost of his own ability to hold a spoon. It was a life of gray mud and green glass, a slow, heavy decline into a silent, leaden world. Chapter 18. The Sludge and the Sinew. Let's drift back toward the city's industrial underbelly, where the air is a permanent cocktail of sulfur and stale grease. Here, we encounter the soap boiler's skimmer. We've talked about the ingredients of soap, but the act of finishing a batch was a slow-motion nightmare. As the tallow and lye reacted in the massive vats, a thick grayish scum would rise to the surface, a mixture of unreacted fat, hair, and various impurities.
The skimmer stood on a damp, slippery platform for hours, using a flat wooden paddle to lift this fetid layer off the top. The steam rising from the vat was a heavy, alkaline mist that would literally dissolve the protective oils on his own skin. By the end of his shift, his hands were ghostly white and felt as though they had been sanded down.
The smell of boiling, rancid animal fat and sharp ammonia would become a permanent part of his identity. He lived in a world of gray bubbles and stinging vapors, cleaning the world's laundry while his own body felt increasingly raw and eroded. Moving from the vats to the dark, damp cellars of the castle, let's consider the saltpeter lixiviator. This is a fancy name for the man who performed the final, most disgusting stage of gunpowder production. Once the saltpeter men had dug up the urine-soaked earth from stables and privies, the lixiviator had to wash it. He would place the filth into large wooden tubs and pour water, or to increase the nitrogen yield, more stale urine, over it. He then had to stir this cold, muddy slurry by hand to ensure the nitrates were fully dissolved. The liquid that drained out, the mother liquor, was a concentrated essence of everything unpleasant about the medieval world. The lixiviator's clothes were permanently stained a dark, earthy brown, and the smell of concentrated ammonia was so strong it would often cause his nose to bleed. He was the man who provided the spark for the king's cannons, but he did so while elbow deep in the kingdom's most matured waste. Let's float over to a job that was as quiet as it was damp, the fisherman's net tanner. In coastal towns, fishing nets were the most expensive tool a man could own. To prevent them from rotting in the salt water, they had to be tanned with a mixture of oak bark and, you guessed it, animal blood or fish oil. The net tanner spent his life in a shed that smelled like a shipwreck. He would pull hundreds of yards of heavy, coarse hemp through vats of dark, sticky liquid. The tanning juice would stain his hands a deep, permanent mahogany, and the salt from the nets would rub his skin raw. He worked in a world of wet knots and metallic-smelling fluids, his fingers constantly snagged by the rough twine. He ensured the nets wouldn't snap under the weight of a haul, while his own joints grew stiff from the constant cold and dampness of his workspace. Then there was the tallow melts mold greaser. In the larger candle-making factories, the finest candles weren't dipped, they were cast in metal molds. To ensure the wax didn't stick, the inside of the molds had to be coated in a thin layer of liquid fat or oil. The greaser's job was to take a small rag and meticulously wipe the inside of hundreds of narrow tubes every day. The room was kept at a stifling temperature to keep the grease liquid, and the air was thick with the scent of hot lipids. The greaser's hands were perpetually slick, and he developed a strange oily cough from inhaling the atomized fat in the air. He lived in a world of shimmering metal and yellow slime, a repetitive, mind-numbing labor that ensured the merchant's candles were perfectly smooth, while his own lungs were slowly becoming waterproofed from the inside out. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the parchment trimmer. After the parchment was scraped, dried, and pumiced, it came in irregular, animal-shaped sheets. The trimmer's job was to take a large, heavy pair of shears and cut these skins into perfect rectangles. He sat in a room filled with the offcuts, strips of dried calf skin that were too small to write on. These scraps would eventually be sent to the glue boilers, but in the meantime they sat in heaps, smelling of lime and old dust. The trimmer's task was one of clinical, repetitive precision. He would slice through the tough, leathery skin thousands of times a day, the sound of the blades a constant snip-snap that echoed in the quiet room. He was the one who gave history its shape, turning a biological remain into a formal document, one steady, dusty cut at a time. Chapter 19. The Ash and the Marrow. Let's drift further away from the trimmer's bench and back toward the roaring orange maw of the city's industrial heart. Here we encounter the furnace feeder. While the master smelter or the glassblower stood at the front directing the craft, the feeder lived in the blind spot of the operation. His entire existence was defined by the shovel and the pile. He was responsible for maintaining the intense, unwavering temperatures required to melt iron or sand, which meant he was in a constant rhythmic battle with the heat. He lived in a state of permanent artificial summer. The skin on his face was often chronically toasted, a deep, angry red that never faded even in the depths of winter. He moved in a haze of charcoal dust and shimmering heat waves, tossing fuel into the furnace every few minutes to prevent a catastrophic drop in temperature. The air he breathed was a thick soup of carbon monoxide and fine white ash. It was a job that required no words, only the steady, soul-crushing repetition of the shovel hitting the stone. He provided the energy for the entire workshop, acting as the human heart of the fire, while his own heart strained under the weight of the heat and the smoke. Moving from the heat of the fire to the cold, clinical silence of the bone sorter's yard, let's consider a different kind of accumulation. We've talked about the grinders and the hagglers, but the sorter was the one who managed the library of the dead. Large medieval cities produced mountains of animal skeletons from the butcheries, and these had to be sorted by type and quality before they could be sold for various industries. The sorter spent his day in a landscape of white and gray. He sat on a low stool, surrounded by baskets, meticulously separating ribs from femurs and skulls from vertebrae. The smell was a dry, chalky scent, the smell of calcium and ancient desiccated marrow. It wasn't the sharp rot of the slaughterhouse, but a more patient, lingering odor that clung to his hair and clothes. He worked in a world of jagged edges and cold stone, his fingers becoming calloused from the constant handling of rough, porous bone. He was the one who gave history its shape, turning a biological remain into a formal document, one steady, dusty cut at a time. Let's float over to a job that was as slippery as it was essential, the cod liver presser. In the fishing ports of the North Sea, oil was a precious resource, and the livers of cod were a primary source. The presser worked in a shed that was perpetually damp and chilled by the sea spray. His job was to take barrels of fermenting livers and squeeze them under heavy wooden screws to extract the rich golden oil.
The smell was legendary, a concentrated, oily fishiness that was so potent it could be detected miles out at sea. The presser's clothes were so saturated with fish oil that they were essentially a second skin, heavy and slick to the touch. He moved in a world of gray slime and golden liquid, his hands constantly pruned by the cold brine. Every turn of the screw released a fresh wave of olfactory assault, yet he worked with a slow, methodical patience, providing the oil that would grease the wheels of industry and provide the medicine for 1,000 sickly children. Then there was the tallow renderer's strainer. We know how the fat was boiled, but before it reached the chandler, it had to be passed through a series of clouts, heavy linen cloths, to catch the final impurities. The strainer's job was to hold these cloths over the cooling vats. He stood in a cloud of warm, oily steam, his task one of absolute greasy stillness. He had to wait as the thick yellow liquid slowly seeped through the fabric, leaving behind a gray, waxy residue. His fingers were perpetually coated in a layer of cooling fat that acted like a glove, dulling his sense of touch. The smell was a heavy, sweet scent of rendered suet that filled his nose and throat. He lived in a world of slow drips and oily mists, ensuring the purity of the tallow, while his own body became a repository for the very grease he was trying to refine. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the parchment starcher. After the parchment was trimmed and pumiced, it was sometimes treated with a size, a thin wash of flour water or boiled bone glue, to create a more receptive surface for the ink. The starcher's job was to take a large, soft sponge and wipe this liquid across the sheets of skin. The room was kept warm to help the starch dry, creating a humid, bready environment that smelled of wet grain and old glue. The starcher's hands were perpetually sticky, and the fine dust from the dried starch would settle in his hair, making him look older than his years. It was a job of gentle, repetitive strokes, performed in a quiet, hazy room.
He was the man who provided the finish for the document, turning the raw skin into a smooth, professional canvas for the scribes of the kingdom. Chapter 20. The Heavy Metal and the Haze. Let's drift away from the starcher's quiet room and descend once more into the cold, jagged shadows of the lead miner's sorter. While the miners faced the collapse of the bell pits, the sorter sat at the surface, in the biting wind of the Peak District or the Mendips, processing the raw ore. Lead ore, or galena, looks like shimmering cubic silver, but it is heavy, unnaturally heavy. The sorter's job was to take a heavy iron hammer and buck the ore, smashing the large rocks into pea-sized bits to separate the lead from the worthless limestone. He spent his day in a cloud of gray metallic dust. Every time the hammer fell, a fine puff of lead carbonate rose into his face. Over the months, he would notice a blue line appearing along his gums, the lead line, a sign that the metal was quite literally becoming a part of his skeleton. His joints would ache with a deep systemic throb, and his movements would become slow and heavy, as if he were walking through water. He was the man who provided the weight for the king's seals and the roofs of the cathedrals, but he did so while his own body became a leaden statue of fatigue. Moving from the gray hills to the cramped, soot-blackened alleys of the city, let's consider the flue scraper's apprentice. We've talked about the chimney sweeps who climbed, but the scraper was the one who dealt with the horizontal flues of the great industrial bakeries and smithies. These were long, narrow stone tunnels where the hot, toxic exhaust of the furnaces settled as a thick, oily crust of creosote. The apprentice had to crawl into these tunnels, often while they were still uncomfortably warm, armed with a short-handled iron scraper. He worked in total darkness, save for a small, guttering tallow candle that consumed what little oxygen was left in the flue. The space was so tight he could only move by wiggling his shoulders, and the soot was so thick it would clog his nostrils and mouth within seconds. He lived in a world of black velvet and suffocating heat, scraping away the fuel of future fires while his own body became a repository for the very grease he was trying to refine. Let's float back to the more organic but no less pungent side of the medieval economy, the bladder blower. This was a specialist role in the butcher's yard. Animal bladders were not thrown away. They were the plastic of the medieval world, used to store lard, medicines, or even as primitive footballs. But to be useful, they had to be cleaned and inflated. The blower's job was to take the raw, wet bladder, wash it in a vinegar solution, and then, using a hollow reed, literally blow it up like a balloon. He spent his day with his mouth pressed to a tube connected to the internal organs of a cow or pig. The smell was a sharp, acidic tang of urea and wet tissue. His cheeks would ache from the constant pressure, and he was perpetually at risk of inhaling the very fluids he was trying to expel. It was a job of intimate, disgusting contact, turning a waste product into a waterproof container through the sheer force of his own breath. Then there was the tallow melts hard fat chopper. Before the suet could be rendered into liquid tallow, it came in massive, cold, and incredibly tough slabs of raw kidney fat. The chopper's job was to take a heavy cleaver and reduce these mountains of white waxy tissue into small cubes so they would melt evenly. He worked in a cold, slippery room where the floor was a permanent hazard of congealed grease. The sound was a rhythmic, wet thud crunch as the blade sliced through the cold fat. His hands were perpetually numb from the cold, and a layer of white, waxy residue would build up under his nails and in the creases of his palms. The smell was a heavy, cloying scent of rendered suet that filled his nose and throat. He lived in a world of slow drips and oily mists, ensuring the purity of the tallow while his own body became a repository for the very grease he was trying to refine. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the parchment gluer.
Sometimes a document was so long it couldn't fit on a single skin, so multiple sheets had to be joined together to form a roll. The gluer's job was to take the scraps from the trimmer and boil them down into a thick, sticky size.
He would then apply this hot, animal-derived adhesive to the edges of the parchment and press them together with a heavy stone weight. The room was filled with the smell of boiling skin and the humid steam of the glue pot. The gluer's fingers were perpetually tacky, and he had to move with extreme care. A single smudge of glue on the writing surface could ruin months of a scribe's work. He was the man who quite literally held history together, creating the great scrolls of the legal courts from a series of individual animal skins, one sticky, steaming seam at a time. Chapter 21. The Slurry and the Slag. Let's float away from the sticky benches of the parchment gluer and move toward the city's industrial outskirts, where the earth itself is turned into a gray, viscous soup. Here, we meet the potter's clay treader. Before the clay could be shaped on a wheel, it had to be tempered and cleared of air bubbles and stones. This wasn't done with a machine. It was done with the human foot. The treader stood in a waist-deep pit of cold, wet clay for the entirety of his day. His job was to walk in a slow, rhythmic circle, sinking into the heavy muck with every step. The suction of the clay was so strong it would try to pull his very skin from his bones as he lifted his feet. The cold was a deep, biting sensation that would eventually settle into his joints as permanent rheumatism. He lived in a world of gray-green sludge. His legs perpetually stained the color of the earth. He provided the consistency for the pots that held the kingdom's water, but he did so while his own body became a stiff, aching monument to the mud. Moving from the clay pits to the hot metallic haze of the bell founder's pit digger, let's consider the preparation for a grand cathedral bell. To cast a bell that weighed several tons, a massive pit had to be dug inside the foundry. This pit was filled with a mixture of loam, horse manure, and hair to create the core of the mold. The digger spent his life in this hole, breathing in the dust of the dried loam and the sharp, ammonia-heavy scent of the manure. The space was cramped, and the air was stagnant. He had to ensure the pit was perfectly level and the earth perfectly packed, or the molten bronze would break through and destroy the foundry. He worked in a silent, subterranean world of brown and gray, his skin perpetually gritty. He was the man who created the void into which the voice of the church would be poured, a task performed in a cloud of biological dust and heavy, damp earth. Let's drift back to the more visceral world of the tallow melt's hard waste collector. We've talked about the rendering of fat, but once the oil was gone and the cracklings were removed, there was a layer of sediment at the very bottom of the vat, a mixture of burnt hair, bits of bone, and unidentifiable organic grit. The collector's job was to climb into the still warm, greasy vat and scrape this sludge into buckets. It was a job of total immersion in the dregs of the animal kingdom. The smell was a concentrated, oily decay that was almost thick enough to chew. His clothes were so saturated with this bottom fat that they would essentially never dry, remaining in a state of permanent, rancid dampness. He was the man who cleaned the very last remnants of the slaughterhouse, turning the most unusable waste into a heavy grease used for the axles of the city's carts. Then there was the glue boiler's bone breaker. Before the bones could be boiled for glue, they had to be smashed into tiny fragments to release the collagen. The breaker sat in a yard filled with piles of sun-bleached animal remains, armed with a heavy iron mallet and a stone anvil. The sound was a constant, bone-jarring crack, shatter, crack that would leave his ears ringing for hours after his shift ended. Every strike sent tiny shards of bone flying into the air, occasionally nicking his face or hands. The dust was a fine white powder that tasted of calcium and old marrow. He lived in a world of white shards and repetitive vibration,
his hands perpetually calloused and his clothes covered in the flour of the dead. He provided the raw material for the adhesives of the world, one violent rhythmic blow at a time. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the parchment whitener. After the skin was joined and starched, it was often still a bit too yellow for a high-status document. The whitener's job was to rub chalk of Briançon or powdered gypsum onto the surface of the skin. He worked in a small, airless room filled with a fine white fog of mineral dust. He used a heavy wooden block to press the powder into the pores of the parchment, moving in a slow, circular motion that never changed. By the end of the day, he looked like a ghost, his hair and skin completely coated in a layer of white chalk. Every breath he took was filled with the dry, chalky powder, making his throat feel as though it were lined with stone. He was the man who provided the purity of the document, turning the yellowed remains of a calf into a bright white surface for the king's law, one dusty, hypnotic circle at a time. Chapter 22: The Brine and the Black Damp. Let's drift away from the white dust of the parchment whitener and return to the stinging, humid air of the brine hauler. In towns where salt was produced from natural springs, the water had to be moved from the well to the boiling pans. This was done by hand, using heavy wooden yokes and buckets. The hauler spent his day in a state of permanent saturation. Every step caused the highly concentrated salt water to slosh over his shoulders and down his back. As the water evaporated in the wind, it left behind a layer of jagged salt crystals that acted like sandpaper against his skin. His clothes were so stiff with salt that they could stand on their own, and his skin was a map of brine burns, red, weeping sores that never had a chance to heal because they were constantly being re-salted. He was a man made of crust and sting, providing the raw material for the kingdom's preservation, while his own body became a stiff, aching monument to the brine.
The muckraker's sorter. Moving back into the city's drainage systems, let's look at the muckraker's sorter. When the street gutters were cleared of their kennel sludge, the waste wasn't just discarded, it was processed for night soil, human waste used as fertilizer. The sorter's job was to stand in a yard filled with mounds of semi-liquid urban filth. Using a long-handled rake and his own gloveless hands, he had to separate the pure organic waste from the inorganic debris, like broken pottery, stones, or dead vermin. The smell was a concentrated, fermented punch of the entire city's metabolic output. The sorter lived at the center of this olfactory cyclone, his nose inches away from the muck as he looked for black gold to sell to the local farmers. He was the human filter of the medieval economy, ensuring that the city's waste became the countryside's harvest, one wet, heavy rake stroke at a time. The tallow melt's floor scraper. In the massive candle-making workshops, the floor was a living entity of grease. Every splash of tallow, every drop of oil, and every bit of soot from the furnaces settled into a thick, black, slippery carpet. The floor scraper's job was to take a flat iron hoe and peel this layer of workshop muck from the stone. It wasn't just fat, it was a congealed history of the week's work, filled with wick trimmings, dead flies, and charcoal dust. The scraper had to exert immense physical force to cut through the waxy buildup. The smell was a heavy, oxidized rancidity that sat in the back of the throat. He worked on his hands and knees in a world of gray-black slime, ensuring that the master chandler didn't slip and fall into a boiling vat, while he himself lived in a state of permanent greasy darkness. The iron smelter's tuyere cleaner. Let's float toward the heat of the iron forge. The tuyere was the small clay or iron pipe that allowed air from the bellows to enter the furnace.
Because of the intense heat and the impurities in the iron, these pipes would constantly clog with clinker, a glassy, rock-hard slag. The tuyere cleaner had to lean into the radiating heat of the furnace with a long iron rod to chip away these obstructions. The heat was so intense it could singe eyebrows in seconds, and the glare from the molting core of the furnace would cause glass-blower's cataract, a permanent clouding of the eyes. He lived in a world of orange light and searing air, performing a delicate, violent surgery on the furnace to keep it breathing. He was the man who prevented the fire from choking, ensuring the iron stayed liquid at the cost of his own vision and skin. The parchment burnisher. Finally, for this leg of our journey, let's look at the parchment burnisher. After the whitening and the starching, the highest quality vellum needed a mirror finish. The burnisher used a highly polished tooth, usually from a boar or a large hound, fixed to a wooden handle. He would rub this tooth across the surface of the skin with immense pressure. It was a job of extreme localized friction. The sound was a rhythmic, squeaky rub, rub, rub that filled the small, quiet room. The burnisher's shoulder and wrist were in constant, agonizing motion, and the heat generated by the friction would release a faint, milky scent from the parchment. He spent his day hunched over a desk, his eyes inches away from the skin, ensuring there wasn't a single microscopic bump that could catch a scribe's quill. He provided the final glassy perfection for the kingdom's treaties, one grueling high-pressure stroke at a time. Chapter 23. The Pitch and the Purgatory. Let's step away from the polished vellum and back into the thick, choking air of the pitch mender. In the medieval world, anything made of wood that needed to hold water, be it a merchant ship, a dyer's vat, or a town conduit, depended on pitch. But pitch is brittle. It cracks with the frost and thaws in the sun. The mender's job was to hunt for these microscopic fissures. He carried a small portable brazier filled with glowing coals and a re-hotting iron. He spent his day hunched over hulls or vats, melting the old blackened resin and pressing fresh boiling tar into the cracks with his bare thumbs or a scrap of leather. The smell was a suffocating medicinal cloud of burnt pine and bitumen. His hands were a permanent, leathery black, the pitch so deeply embedded in his fingerprints that he could no longer feel heat or cold. He was the man who kept the city from leaking, working in a world of sticky shadows and localized burns, ensuring the vessels of commerce stayed afloat, while his own lungs felt increasingly heavy and sealed. The soot merchant's sifter. While the chimney sweeps gathered the black dust, the soot merchant's sifter turned it into a product. Soot was a valuable commodity, used as a pigment for ink, a fertilizer for specific crops, and even a primitive form of pesticide. The sifter worked in a windowless shed, processing the raw chimney scrapings. His job was to pass the soot through a series of fine silk or wire sieves to remove bits of mortar and charred wood. Because soot is incredibly light, the slightest movement sent a cloud of black particles into the air. The sifter's world was a monochromatic nightmare. Every time he blinked, a rim of black dust settled on his eyeballs. He breathed in the concentrated essence of 1,000 domestic fires. Over time, the soot would settle into his pores, giving his skin a permanent dusky hue that no amount of lye could wash away. He was the man who turned the city's exhaust into black gold, living in a silent, suffocating haze where the sun never quite reached.
The tallow melt's wick twister. In the back rooms of the candle shops, before the dipping could begin, there was the wick twister. While it sounds domestic, medieval wicks weren't just string. They were made of tow, the coarsest, dirtiest fibers of flax or hemp left over after the fine linen was taken. The twister's hands were perpetually raw. He had to pull the rough, splinter-filled fibers through his fingers, twisting them into a uniform cord. To keep the fibers from fraying, he would often use spittle or a bit of rancid grease. The dust from the hemp, the chives, would fill the air, causing a condition known as Monday fever, byssinosis, a chest-tightening cough that never truly went away. He sat in a world of brown dust and stinging fingers, producing the literal heart of the candle from the dregs of the harvest. He provided the vehicle for the flame, working in a slow, rhythmic monotony that left his hands calloused and his breath short. The glue boiler's hoof trimmer. Before the hooves of horses and oxen could be tossed into the boiling vat to make the strongest glues, they had to be prepared. The hoof trimmer sat in the dead yard, surrounded by piles of discarded animal feet. His job was to use a heavy, curved knife to slice away the outer horn and any remaining hair or frog, the soft part of the hoof, that would contaminate the glue. The smell was a sharp, farmyard funk of old manure and keratin. Because the hoofs were often caked in dried mud and stones, his blade would frequently slip, leading to jagged cuts that were immediately exposed to the filth of the yard. He worked in a world of rhythmic slicing and dull thuds, the air thick with the scent of warm horn. He was the first step in the alchemy of the adhesive, turning the hardest parts of the beast into a liquid that could hold a cathedral's doors together. The parchment pouncer. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the parchment pouncer. Even after burnishing, the surface of the vellum could sometimes be too oily for the ink to bite. The pouncer's job was to apply a fine dust of pounce, ground cuttlefish bone or sandarac resin. He used a small felt-covered weight to rub this abrasive powder into the skin. It was a job of extreme, quiet delicacy. If he rubbed too hard, he would scratch the surface. Too light, and the ink would run. The room was filled with the dry, fishy scent of the ground cuttlebone. The pouncer's world was one of white clouds and microscopic friction. He spent his day leaning over the desk, his breath disturbing the fine powder, ensuring that the scribe's first stroke would be permanent. He was the man who prepared the grip for history, one dusty, rhythmic circle at a time. Chapter 24. The Slag and the Sinew. Let's drift away from the white dust of the pouncer's desk and descend once more into the intense, flickering shadows of the slag haver. In the medieval smelting yards, after the iron had been tapped, there remained a mountain of slag, the glassy, cooling, stony waste that floated on top of the molten metal. The slag haver's job was to break this brittle, razor-sharp material into manageable chunks while it was still radiating a skin-blistering heat. He used a heavy iron bar to pry the cooling crust apart. The air around him was filled with glass smoke, tiny airborne shards of silicate that would settle in his eyes and lungs. He moved in a world of gray-black rock and orange heat ripples, his clothes often smoldering from the proximity to the waste. The smell was a dry, metallic, scorched earth scent. He was the man who cleared the path for the next day's melt, a laborer of the aftermath, spending his strength on the cooling debris of the kingdom's weaponry. The muckraker's ladle man. Moving from the heat of the forge to the damp chill of the city's cesspits, let's consider a specialized role within the gong farming trade, the ladle man. When a pit was too deep or the waste too liquid for a shovel, the ladle man had to use a bucket on a pole. He stood at the edge of the pit, performing a slow, rhythmic dipping motion. The physical strain on his lower back was constant, as he had to counterbalance the weight of a heavy, dripping bucket at the end of a 10-foot ash pole. Every lift brought the gas of the pit directly into his face, a warm, choking cloud of methane and hydrogen sulfide.
He worked in the dead of night, his only light a small lantern that, if the gases were thick enough, could ignite a flash fire in the pit. He was a man of the deep sludge, moving with a careful, heavy grace to ensure the vaults of the wealthy didn't overflow into the streets. The tallow melts cauldron scrubber. Once the vats of tallow were emptied and the candles were cast, the industrial cauldrons had to be cleaned before the next batch of fat arrived. This was the job of the cauldron scrubber. He had to climb inside the massive iron pots while they were still uncomfortably warm. Armed with a stiff wire brush and a bucket of lye, he had to scrape away the burnt fat residue that had fused to the bottom. The space was an echoing metallic chamber of heat and fumes. The steam from the lye reacting with the old grease would create a caustic mist that burned his throat and eyes. He worked in a world of slippery black iron and yellow steam, his fingers perpetually wrinkled and raw from the chemicals. He ensured the next batch of light wasn't tainted by the rot of the last, a man who lived in the belly of the beast, cleaning the vessels of the kingdom's illumination. The glue boiler's hide stripper. Before the scraps of leather and hide could be boiled into glue, any remaining flesh bits or fat had to be manually removed. The hide stripper sat in a damp, cold shed, working with hides that were often matured, which is a polite way of saying they had begun to ferment. He used a dull, curved blade to scrape the underside of the skin. The sound was a wet, rhythmic schloop as the gray, fatty tissue was separated from the leather. The smell was a heavy, sweet rot that seemed to coat his tongue. Because the hides were often treated with lime, his hands were a map of white chemical burns and dark, infected cuts from the blade. He worked in a world of cold, slippery membranes, providing the pure protein for the kingdom's strongest adhesives, one nauseating scrape at a time.
The parchment sanderacker. Finally, for this chapter, let's look at the parchment sanderacker. For the most important royal charters, even pouncing wasn't enough. The skin had to be treated with sanderac, a rare resin from the cypress tree. The sanderacker's job was to grind this resin into an impossibly fine powder and then melt it into the surface of the parchment using a heated iron weight. This created a waterproof, glassy finish that would preserve the ink for centuries. The room was filled with the heavy, incense-like scent of the burning resin, mixed with the milky smell of the parchment. The sanderacker's world was one of intense heat and aromatic smoke. He had to move the iron with perfect, steady speed. If he stopped for a second, he would scorch the skin. He provided the eternal finish for the kingdom's laws, working in a golden haze of resin steam and high-stakes precision.